Great, thank you so much for your introduction. Very grateful, thank you. And an extended welcome to share Bristol Academy. And obviously, Richard's family, friends who are here this evening. Welcome. It's a very special moment. I guess I'm just giving you Richard's been very well, so I'm doing it in mind, so I thought we were very sure. But if I may say so, first spoke to Richard about the story of 2015 when I was working in the program my pictures. And I thought, definitely seems to be Richard, because I know because we all know about Reddit in the 90s. And so I kind of asked Richard whether he would agree with my sister. And I didn't get Richard, so that was a no. I kept on asking and asking, and he said, I'll get back to you. And he never did. Until eventually, Richard got back to me and said, I'm free next week. Is the show still on? And I said, the show is still on. I will make a way for you to be interviewed. And it was a great interview from my question. But afterwards, he said, I've never really opened up. And it felt good. It was cathartic. So, Richard, would you like to come here?
Andrew? Oh, hold on, I'm going to turn them on. Okay.
But I think we want to tell the story. We want to tell the story. There was a village. It was almost like he needed therapy to stay in So he said he wanted to write a book. And I said, well, that's brilliant. And I said, I don't really do books, I do pictures, films. So he said, I'll work on a print while you work on a book. So needless to say, the book is now here. Film, watch this space. But can I just introduce Richard onto the stage? Richard Stokes.
Now, I need to find out which mic I'm using. Oh, that means this one. Would you like me to stick with this one? Okay, I will for the time being anyway. Rich, are you comfortable?
I'm very comfortable.
Good. How are you feeling? You've got your friends, you've got your family here, you've got people here who love you. You're going through a journey, and you've always been going through this journey. But this is something that you wanted to do. You wanted to write the book. Maybe we should start with the therapy that it gave you. How did you feel delving into your life and putting pen to paper, as it were, and telling your truth? Because I know it wasn't easy, but you did it. It took a long time, a lot of soul searching, but you're here.
So I started to realize I needed to write a book because of the many people that I know and the many people I've met throughout my life, especially since I left the army. And when I told them just snippets of my story, most of them said, you need to write a book. To go back a little bit, it was actually Paul Stevenson who was the very first person when I came out of the army in 1991. He took me to Swiss Cottage in London to write a book, to find a publisher. And the publisher was called Express. And there's a lot of black themed books like Yardie and Cop Killer. And we went to them, told them the story. They came to Bristol and spent a good couple of weeks recording what I had to say. Only for about a couple of weeks later for them to turn around and say, actually, the story's too big. And when I asked them why the story was too big, it's because it was in two halves. So one half was about my upbringing, my adoption, and the second half was about the army and the racism. So for many years, we didn't get anybody to publish the book. Equally, for many years, I procrastinated about writing the book because of all the detail in it, all the people that were involved in it, many different emotions, whether I protect people, whether I hurt people in doing so. But I got to a stage in my life, in my journey, where I felt it needed to be done. Because for many, many different reasons, but generally because the state of the world at the moment with regards to racism. We shouldn't really be here in 2022 talking about racism. It should be long gone, and it's still here. So that was one of the key reasons. The other reason I decided to write the book was because of my mama. Rest in peace. One day when I went to go and see my mama, she showed me all the pictures she had on the wall of me in the Guards and said to me, just out of the blue, when are you going to write this book then? And I said, which book, Mama? And she said, the book that I need to read before I die. Well, I'm sad to say that I actually failed that mission and she passed away and the book wasn't written. So, again, another reason to write the book, and another reason to finish it, another reason to stop procrastinating and putting it off. And I will say that I have to thank my wife, Lynn, for pushing me, for Sherry, for actually believing in me and taking on this big challenge.
Yes, it's a challenge, and the challenge isn't over, but you're on your way. I'm wondering where we should start, because you've given us so many themes, and I think what shouts out to me is the interracial adoption. And maybe we should start there. When you were 9 months old, you were a baby, beautiful baby, and a family came to say they wanted you. They chose you. When did you realize you were adopted?
I realized I was adopted when my parents told me. But my dad always told me that when I was maybe 3 or 4, I had this tendency to look at my own skin and then look at my adoptive family's skin. And obviously puzzling about what was happening. And maybe about 5, my parents told me that I was adopted, and the reason why, my mom was a nurse, young nurse, fresh from Jamaica, and couldn't look after me. So that was the only reason I got.
Your brother and sisters, your mum and dad, your extended family, showered you with love. They loved you unconditionally. But there's a but, isn't there? And the but is to do with culture, is to do with how you felt inside, even though you couldn't express yourself, you couldn't explain it. But there was something missing. And I'm not even talking about your color. I'm talking about something inside that you knew wasn't there but should have been. Could you talk about that?
Well, so you're right. I did feel a lot of love, and my family and my parents did give me a lot of love unconditionally. But I think in my later life, I realized that a bond between a mother and a child is something that really shouldn't be broken. And when it is broken, you actually miss that. And as a child, you can't articulate it, you can't put it into words. It's just a longing that you get for most of your life, if not all of your life. And that longing manifested in many different ways. Mainly for me, in terms of my behavior as a child, seemingly always in trouble for something, and driving my parents crazy. And that was a general theme all the way up until I was about 14. As I say, at the time, I didn't really know what I was going through, why I was in trouble all the time. It's only in my later years, really, that I started to do some soul searching and try to find and understand who I was. And in that searching, then I realized, on reflecting back, what I was rebelling about, why I was in trouble. And I think it was that longing and that yearning for who I was.
I want to say, who are you? But I'm going to save that. Tell me about school, growing up. What was school like? And what was the environment like in your school?
So we, as a family, moved around extensively. Probably maybe sometimes twice in a couple of years. Most of the places we lived was rural, affluent, and void of any culture in terms of other people from minorities. And so the schools were exactly the same. So all the pupils white, all the teachers white, and I guess from day one, really, any school that I stepped into, I stood out. And we talk about nowadays institutionalized racism. I believe I met institutionalized racism way before Macpherson. By that, what I mean is in the systems in the schools, the policies, the teaching, the curriculum, the staff were configured in a way where they lived by the stereotypes presented as black people. And that played out in terms of how I was treated. I wouldn't say that as a child I was a non-intelligent child. I remember in classes I used to put my hand up to answer questions, keen, and always been told to put my hand down and let somebody else answer. So I picked up on these behaviors from teachers, and of course I rebelled. And so that was the beginning of my troublesome years in school, which resulted in expulsion around about 4 or 5, and then a string of suspensions. Mainly the reasons why I rebelled apart from the teachers was because of how the other children treated me, They used to ask, why is your skin black? Does it rub off? Is your tongue black? Stick your tongue out? Are your gums black? And the usual learned behavior names, gollywog, nigger, coolie, blackjack. I didn't really have any cultural reference. Microaggressions, the standoffishness, the staring, the whispering, and I guess over time that created a feeling of isolation. I think it's fair to say also that when I went home I recognized similar microaggressions. Similar difference in treatment. I just felt trapped between these two environments that I was exposed to.
Let's just go back to school a moment. So If you had black teachers, for example, black friends, a point of reference, as you mentioned, what difference do you think that would have made?
later years. Yeah, your birth mum giving you a hug right there. So there was a time when you said, I want to meet my birth mum. It's what I want to do. It may have been something you were thinking about for a long time, but it's difficult to put that into words to your parents. And also you didn't want to hurt anybody. So take us on that journey.
So anytime that I was in trouble and I would get punished, I would think about my mum. And I would dream about her. I would actually dream about a whole black family, really. It'd be a reoccurring dream. And this continued all the way through into my teens. But my mum and dad always said that if I wanted to, they would help me find my mum and dad when I got older. And once I joined the army, once I joined the guards, there was a point where I really needed to spend that ACE card. And so I was about 6 months into training, and the racism was at its peak. The media started to take notice, and I appeared in local papers. So the racist treatment accelerated because I was getting a lot of attention. And the level of racism was of such that it affected the way I was progressing in training. So the army gave me an ultimatum. If I didn't improve in my training, then they would boot me out. At that point, I actually wanted to leave anyway. It was just far too much to take. So we kind of came to an agreement. The army said, well, you can go home and talk to your dad and see what you can come up with, and then come back and we'll sort something out. So I went home and spoke to my dad. We went out for dinner. And he said, what can I do to make you stay? I mean, you've got 6 months in, and you could be on to a great achievement. So I fought for a little while, and I remembered that ACE card I had in my pocket. And I called it. And I said, well, if you can find my mum in time, then for me to pass out, then I will stay. And I went back to the army camp and decided to put my best foot forward and challenge these racists and these bigots and achieve that aim. About 2 months after I came back,
I was on a shooting range, and one of the sergeants shouted, "Stokes, you need to get back to the army, get back to the barracks. Your dad's coming with your mum." And I just thought, well, I'd kind of forgotten about what I'd asked my dad, and I thought it was my adoptive mum coming with my dad. So as I got changed and came back to the commandant's office, he then dropped on me, "Okay, your dad's coming with your birth mum." So the whole ground just moved away from me, and I was actually carrying some tea and coffee at the time, which ended up most of it on the floor because I was so nervous. And so went into a room, and there I saw my mum and this young, beautiful Jamaican woman. And it was one of the most amazing moments in my life. And we talked for about an hour. My dad was there, and we all hugged. And for me, that changed everything.
Game changer. What do you talk about for an hour? What do you talk about when you meet your birth mum for the first time?
I told her about all the dreams that I had. I told her about
It's okay.
I told her about the journey that I'd been on, and
Do you know the nice thing here, Rich, is that everyone here is here for you. And we'll come back. It's okay to go round in circles and come back to birth mum. But let's go to King Charles, or Prince Charles then. I guess he was one of the people who kind of started this off for you in the first place. He commented that there wasn't enough diversity under the bearskin. Your dad picked up on that. And then there was diversity under the bearskin, but a lot happened in between. So, do you want to pick up the story? Your dad told you to go to the careers office.
Sure. So before I joined the army, I'd spent my last 3 schooling years in Scotland, up in Fife. And I left school about 16 and came back to Bristol where my parents were living. And my dad immediately said, "No, I don't think you're going to be lounging around, and you need to get something done." So I knew he was serious, and so I got a job. I actually ran away from the job, and I thought I was quite smart about it until my dad kind of went a bit mad, and then just immediately said, "Okay, you're going down the Army Careers Office." I wouldn't say it was all his choice. I had gone to Army Cadets at about 14 and really enjoyed that lifestyle. The drill, the weapons, and out in the field. But he sent me the memos, and I looked at all the regiments. I actually wanted to join the engineers or the Royal Mechanical Corps. I'd done mechanics at school, so I wanted to continue from that. Anyway, I didn't score enough in the test, so I actually only had the infantry to choose from. So I went home with a whole list of regiments to my dad, and he immediately picked out the Guards.
And I wonder why he did that. And what it was in, I think, 1985, Prince Charles had come on, or King Charles had come on the TV, talking about the fact there was no diversity in the household brigade, which are the household guards. And he was determined to change that. No, I hadn't seen that, and if I had seen it, I was too young to even pay any attention. But my dad, I think he had seen it. And obviously he rubbed his hands with glee and said, well, yeah, I know somebody who's a good candidate for that. And then sent me back down the careers office and said, right, tell him you want to join the guards. Tell him you want to join the guards. And so at that point, I didn't know who the guards were, as in terms of the regiments. I think I'd been to see them when I was a kid. So I went down the careers office, and they said to me, okay, well, there's 5 regiments of foot guards, the Irish, the Scotch, the Welsh, the Coldstream, and the Grenadiers. He said, don't join the Scots Guards, they won't have you. Don't join the Welsh Guards, they won't have you. Don't join the Irish Guards, they won't have you. And I asked them, why? And they said, well, because you're black. And so that just left the Coldstream and the Grenadiers. None of them meant anything to me at all. So I chose the Coldstream Guards and went home and told my dad, and he was over the moon about it. So the next thing, I was off to the assessment centre up in Sutton Coldfield. And along with 200, 300 other soldiers, there was a time when we was in an auditorium and we all had to put our hands up when they called out the regiments that we were going to go into. They really put their hands up when their regiments were called. And when the Coldstream Guards were called, I put my hand up. And more people than I see here turned around and looked at me as if I had gone crazy. So at that point I thought, okay, there's something amiss here. But just kind of forgot it. So I passed the assessment centre and I was on my way to the army, or to the Guards depot, which was in Purbright, Surrey. And then the reality struck. Do you want me to continue? Yeah, go. Then the reality struck. So there's a train station close to the army camp, and everybody who's joining the Guards, and we shared the camp with the parachute regiment, ends up at that train station. And then you get a bus we call the White Elephant, just a nondescript white bus that will pick you up and take you to the train, to the army camp. And even when I got to the train station, people were asking, oh, what regiment are you going into? What regiment are you going to? And I told them the Coldstream Guards. And again, I got that look, and I got the whispers, and I got the sniggers. So I thought, okay, what's going on here? So we get on the bus, and the sergeant that ushered us onto the bus looked at me and said, what regiment are you joining? And I said, the Coldstream Guards. And he just looked at me and laughed. So we got to the camp, and there's 200-300 soldiers just drilling, marching up and down. As we got off the bus, they all stopped and took one look at me, and that's when the names started to come out. The nigger, the coon, the wog, black bastard, go back to where you came from. And that was my introduction to the first day in the Guards. And for the 6 to 9 months that followed, that would be my general treatment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pausing, and I think we all just need a pause. Because in total, you were in the army for 5-6 years, and every day of your life, you have a story to tell, and that story isn't necessarily a positive one. there's one name that I want to pick out, and that name is O'Keefe. And I know there are children here, and you don't want to swear, but I do want you to tell me about that person, O'Keefe.
So Sergeant O'Keefe was a Coldstreams guard, and he took a personal dislike to me. He would always tell me that don't think I'm special because I'm black. And he basically said to me all the time that he would do his best to make sure that I wouldn't ever stand outside the palace as a Grenadier Guard or a Coldstream Guard. And he would have me in the stores for my whole army career until I decided to leave. Even up to the Passing Out Parade, which is the sort of final parade before you actually finish your training, with the mass press present, he came out to me and still told me that I wasn't special. I was just a plain old black bastard. And he was my nemesis throughout the whole time in the army.
When you complained, what did people do? How did you get help?
I only ever complained once when I was in the Guards, and that pretty much backfired on me. It was partly my fault, because like every young recruit, we were encouraged to sneak out in our first couple of months and go on the drinking spree, which I partook in, and I ended up at the British Legion, which is a general drinking hole for any ex-military people here, and where I met two of my other nemesis, Sergeant and Corporal O'Regan. And they'd paid me a visit before in the first week of my time there. Sergeant O'Regan came into my barrack room and said, asked me what I was doing in the Guards. I'm a black bastard, what am I doing here? So then he undid his trousers and pulled out his privates, and on that was a swastika, which he said, do you know what that is? And I said, no. And he said, that stands for Nazi. And I am Nazi, I am National Front, and we don't have black bastards like you in the Guards. And if you know what's good for you, you'll be gone by tomorrow. So on that unfortunate night I went out on the drinking, he was also there. And I went out with about 5 or 6 of my fellow recruits. And as we entered, the whole place stood still. And we still got a drink, but a couple of the goons that were Sergeant O'Regan's friends came over and started threatening us. And most of my fellow comrades left and left me there. So I finished my drink and headed my way out. And on the way out, I was gripped up against the wall and held at knife point and told to leave. So the drinking hole was quite far from where the camp was, so I had to make my way back, and all my friends had gone. And so when I got back to the camp eventually, the next morning the room was inspected, and a captain came to me and said that he'd heard something and was I okay? And so I ended up telling him exactly what had happened. And he assured me that those responsible would be sent back to the camp, which actually never happened. What actually happened was that I
ended up in jail for a couple of weeks for drinking underage and leaving the camp.
Every day, Richard, you're going through horror stories, okay? Every day, you have to live through this reality. And when you go home, how do you start to explain to your parents and your siblings what you're going through?
I think maybe for the first 3 months, I didn't tell them anything. I mean, back in those days, there was no mobile phone. It would have just been letter. And it got to a point where, you know, I couldn't really take any more. And I wrote to my sister Katie to tell her about what was happening. I didn't write to my parents because I didn't want them to worry about anything. I was closest to Katie and had been throughout all of my schooling. She was the one that always stuck up for me. And so I felt that she was a safe person to confide in.
And your sister Katie, she's the closest to your age, but you're young and she's young. How could she help you?
Because I think I shared everything with Katie, and
And it's having someone to talk to, someone who understands you. It didn't matter. It was that you shared that with somebody, and that somebody was Katie.
Yeah. I think it's a lot different now, but back then, there was no diversity inclusion program or training on that. There was no lawyers or legislation that would protect you. So.
Did you feel alone?
Yeah, most of the time. Most of the time.
Yeah. What was Christmas like?
Well, I would get to go home for Christmas, and Christmas for me was like anybody, that warm time, that family time. And with a birthday close to Christmas, obviously I got double presents, so that was good. And I always love my food, so But yeah, it was a special time with the family.
Do you want to take a break, Rich?
No, I'm good.
Have some water. Pretty sure it's water. Everyone okay here? Yeah? I guess we need to go back to the army. Yeah? Let me just take you back there. You were posted to Northern Ireland. You went to lots of different places. But I want to focus on Northern Ireland, and I want to talk about Kenya. But let's start with Kenya. So you hadn't been to Africa before. This was a brand new experience for you. You were excited. This is a wonderful landmass. And you get there, and you're a star. They love you. And there is something that you shared in common with the African people, and you love that. Tell us about your African experience.
So we, in peacetime, you were deployed to various places around the world for training, and Africa or Kenya was one of those places. And when they announced to us that we were going to Kenya, I was just so excited about it. And I remember actually getting off the plane and touching Kenyan soil for the first time. And that feeling of electricity just rising up from my feet and going through my whole body. And for me, it felt like I was home. And in that moment, I just contrasted the treatment that I'd gone through and where I was at that moment in time, that land of blackness and heat and beauty and acceptance. And it just filled me with a feeling that I'd never felt before. And just felt like home. And I remember on the first day we got to camp, and the whole camp is fenced off with what would be chicken wire. And the locals came up and saw me there, and then they disappeared. And then about a couple of hours they came back with a wheelbarrow full of fruit and vegetables and pointed to me and said, "That's yours."
Did you feel special, Richard?
I felt like a king, really, and they allowed the sergeants allowed them to bring it into the camp, and I just gave it to everybody. And from that day, the first day that we got there, they came back every day and took me into the town, and just practically adopted me for the 6 weeks that we were there. To some of my colleagues, they thought it was great, but to many, it was a point of jealousy and a point of hatred. And I spent as much time out of the camp as possible, because when I went back, it was the name calling and the offishness all over again. So I never got away from it. It was always that contrast. So I ended up submerging myself in that African environment. And especially when we went on exercise, when we stayed with the Masai Mara. And again, the Masai Mara took me under their wing. And when they slept, they wanted me to come and sleep with them. And actually, the captains allowed that to happen. It wasn't too far away, but they allowed that to happen. So, Kenya was a special place for me because generally of that acceptance.
Can you explain what difference Kenya, the impact Kenya had on your life? Because you were talking about growing up with whiteness and going to Africa for the first time. You see blackness, you see yourself, and it's good, it's positive. Can you put into words that feeling inside that maybe when you were younger you couldn't express?
I think it was the connectedness. It's hard to articulate. I think
I think it's on a spiritual level, really. As I've said, you know, I have no doubt that my white family, my adopted family, love me as any family would love their children or their siblings. But there is a distinct difference. And I guess I didn't know that until I was amongst my own black people, and I got that spiritual connection. That for me was what it was. And I think it opened up my appetite to find out who I was in entirety. And so that set me on my own journey of discovery, which continued to this day.
Well, Richard, we're really going on a roller coaster here. I did say that we would go to Northern Ireland. It's a contrast, isn't it? How do you want to play that story out, which is in the book? Northern Ireland, not a great experience.
Not a great experience. So if I go back to when I passed out in 1987, I had both my families there, my black family and my white family. And I had all the media there as well. Not something that I particularly wanted, but I didn't have any choice about it. So, because of the media attention, I had about a long weekend before I went to Northern Ireland. And my first day in Northern Ireland, all the soldiers that I trained with and went through thick and thin with were warned off by the soldiers that were already there not to be nigger lovers, and if they knew what was good for them, they would stay away from me. And that's exactly what they did. So on that first day, most people would phone back their parents and phone back their family to say they'd arrived in Northern Ireland. So I remember asking for some change for the phone, asking my friends, and they wouldn't talk to me. They just turned their back and ignored me. And there was about 20 of them. So I didn't really know why this was until one of them told me that they'd been basically threatened that if they talked to me, they would get beat up. So we all went to the mess hall, which is where you eat your food. And as I entered the mess hall, at least 3/4 of the people in there, probably about 200 people, started banging plates and chanting all the racist words, and then just got up and left.
Left you there?
Yeah, and the ones that were left threw bananas and came up and stubbed their cigarettes out of my food, and yeah, just made that first day one of the worst days in Northern Ireland. That same night, when we were shown our barrack rooms, we were talking about what had happened, and that's when I knew my friends had been threatened. And it was late at night, and this noise. We heard, what seemed like about 20 guys, clearly drunk, singing songs about how they were gonna kill me off. And then they came to the back room and started trying to kick the door down and threatening to kill me. So for the next 3 months, I didn't go to the mess hall for food. I went to the local shop called the Naffy and just ate out of my room.
Rich, did you fear for your life?
Yeah, pretty much.
It's heartbreaking. You're a grown man now, and we're talking about when Richard was a teenager. You were a teenager, and you were going through all this stuff. But Rich, do you know something? You have survived to tell this tale. You are a survivor. And you're going to continue to educate people because you want people to know what you went through. And this is, like I say, a therapy for you. And you want people to benefit from your story. How can people benefit from your narrative?
I think my story is just one of thousands, possibly millions stories under the theme of racism. And like many other isms and forms of discrimination, only those who've walked the path, only those who've lived the experience can truly understand it. And so when I hear racism being gaslighted and minimized, overlooked, pushed it aside, apportioned to somebody else's problem. Well, that's frustrating. That makes me angry because most people only know what racism is from the stories they're told. And I got tired of telling the story in bits and pieces and fragments. And I got tired of carrying that baggage. So I offloaded that baggage. And I've exposed many things and probably not enough because I felt that people didn't understand the depth of racism, the many layers of racism, and how it pervades everything. It's like a cancer. It can be overt, it can be covert, it can be hidden in plain sight. And it's taken at least 30 years of research, soul searching, talking to people, travel, to really get a good understanding of what racism is. And I wouldn't say I know it all, but I know enough. And I want everybody to know enough
so that we can start to dismantle it.
With your experience, Rich, what do you tell your children? There may be a lot that you haven't told them, but today you've exposed a lot and you've disclosed a lot. What do you tell your children about racism?
You know, I made a pact with my wife a long time ago that when the children were born, we wouldn't expose them to racism. We wouldn't push that on them. We'd let them discover it for themselves, and then we would answer questions. But what I tell them is that they shouldn't have to go through racism. They shouldn't have to go through what I went through, what other people have gone through. I tell them they're beautiful souls, and they shouldn't be defined by racism. They shouldn't be defined by race. But unfortunately, they have to carry the torch to combat racism.
Maybe something that we all have to do. So, Rich, we're not at the end. I think I need a time check, but I know also that people in the audience will want to ask you some questions as well. And maybe that's a good time to for us to pause. Karen, can we have a time check? Where are we now? 8:30. Oh, brilliant. Okay, so we have come to that moment, Rich. Thank you so much for sharing your story. This is a snippet of Richard's story, and indeed a snippet of what's in the book. But I hope Richard has just whetted your appetite to maybe ask one or two questions, and maybe at the end to have the opportunity to order Richard's book, Trooping the Culture. But for now, can we just have a huge round of applause for Richard Stokes. Wonderful. So, Karen, I don't know whether you need these microphones, but if there's anyone who would like to ask a question, a couple of questions let's take. Maybe we should do that now. Lovely. Thank you. So immediately I see a hand here.
Hello, Rich. I know you have a beautiful soul. Where do you get the strength from to not break and to not show hatred?
Thank you, Sean. Strength, I think, comes down the line from, firstly, from God, and also from where my true heritage comes from, which is the African continent, the African people.
I would be lying if I said I didn't hate or I haven't gone through periods of hate. I have. Certainly during my research, after I came out of the army, when I was researching about Black history, and I started to understand what Black people in general had gone through during slavery, during the Jim Crow days in the States, the journey across those thousands of miles, the lynching. Of course I hated. There was a point where I hated all white people. But the thing about why I couldn't continue that is because I had white people in my life that loved me from a little boy to today. And I've met a lot of people in my life of all colours and backgrounds that have inputted into me wisdom and understanding for me to become who's sitting in front of you today, and who I work with, and who's my family. So I aimed for a balance, to take people on face value and not fall into that trap of judging people by the color of their skin. There's far more to that. That ideology that was created hundreds of years ago has stood the test of time. But when you start to unpick that, it's worth nothing.
Okay, thanks, Rich. There was a little hand here. Would you like to take the microphone? No? You were just waving, yeah? Okay. All right. Any more questions for Richard? There is a hand here. Oh, right here, sorry. And then over here. And then over here. So 1, 2, 3.
Rich, I'm very proud of you. We've had many long, deep conversations around racism, things like that. As you know, I work for the armed forces, have done for a long time. So I know a little bit about what you're talking about, obviously not to the extent. What sort of support systems were in place back in the 80s? Because I started working for the armed forces in the 80s, so I kind of know a little bit about that. But I know these days there's a lot of things in place within diversity and inclusion. They are trying to change this. It's like trying to turn a barge around, actually. But back in the 80s, what sort of support systems were there for you? Was there anybody you could go to outside of your superior officers that would even listen to you or anything like that?
Hi, Kevin, thank you. None. Zero. Not like now. If somebody was in any of the military now, there is somebody to turn to, someone to talk to confidentially. Back in the 80s, there was only, in terms of legislation, the Equal Opportunities or Race Relations Act 75. And really, I don't think anybody knew how to really implement that. Certainly in organizations, there weren't the structures, there weren't diversity and inclusion units. So practically none. Plus I was bound by the Official Secrets Act, so I couldn't talk to the many press that were hanging around the camp or hanging around the train stations or hanging around the drinking spots. The only people I could really talk to was my family. And however, one day I was on camp and I was told that somebody had come to see me. And it happened to be Paul Stevenson. And for those who may not be from Bristol and don't know Paul Stevenson, he was a campaigner against racism. He was one of the many brave people who brought the bus boycott to an end in Bristol. The bus boycott that stopped black people from working and riding on those buses. He used to work for the Commission for Racial Equality, which now is called the Equal and Human Rights Commission. This guy appeared out of nowhere, and I didn't know who he was. He was this black guy, and I had no clue what he was here for. And in all honesty, I didn't trust him. I didn't know him. But he said he was here to help me. He worked for the Commission for Racial Equality. He'd heard about all of what I was going through and said he wanted to fight my case. At that time, Diana Abbott was also a young politician, and she'd spoken with Paul and then decided to speak about my case in Parliament. So even though there was support on the outside, I didn't get that. I wasn't aware of it. So in all honesty, it was total isolation and total introspect to find out the strongest parts of me that would survive that.
And there was a question in the middle there.
Hello, Uncle Richard. My question is, what advice would you give the younger generation that are also carrying the torch within our sectors, but we're battling with the new type of racism where, in contrast to your time during the army, racism is widely accepted as the norm, but now majority of people know better to at least hide it. How would you advise us to defend ourselves and protect ourselves in this new, more intelligent form of racism?
Thank you, Danielle. A big difference between now and when I was in the army is that we have this thing called the internet. And the internet can provide you with lots of information. And for young people, there's an opportunity to find out who you are, what journey your people have come from, where your people have come from, and feel proud about who you are. Immerse yourself in that cultural heritage. That's something I didn't have, and something I had to pick up later on in life. Be proud of who you are. If people have a problem with your black skin, you need to know why they got a problem with that black skin. You need to know what power that black skin has. The power of that black skin was recognized many thousands of years ago, many centuries ago, all the way back to Egyptian times, even all the way back to Sumerian times. And don't take it from me, you go and look on the internet for yourselves. And when you realize you come from that heritage and from that background, you'd understand how special and how powerful that is. One question I've always asked myself is, if black people are so bad, so such an atrocity to some people, then why are we always getting the attention? Why are we always, or our ways being cloned? Why are we always being copied for everything that we do? That, to me, is not hatred. That is something else. So I've turned that around and realized that there's a lot to love about black people. Maybe that's what the problem is. Maybe that love is so strong that it actually turns around to become hate. Don't take it from me. That's some discovery that every young person has to find for themselves.
Yourself and then we end over here in the front.
Richard, thank you for opening up your story to us, and I just think it's so inspiring, obviously challenging, but also inspiring for me to listen to. My question is, you spoke about your parents disciplining you as a child, and obviously parents do have to do that, but did you find any comfort in the fact that your parents chose you? I believe you were adopted into your family. The fact that they chose you, did you find any comfort in that amongst the hardship?
I think for anybody who reads the book, it's important to understand that it's been written across different eras. It's been written across 4 or 5 different decades and in different contexts. And for anybody in my generation, you'll know that a whooping was a standard thing, standard practice. For me, it took to my later life to understand the reasons why I was in trouble, the reason why I was misbehaving. That's not something I understood back then. And I guess through the eyes of my dad, the whooping was necessary, but the level in which it was administered was not necessary, as far as I'm concerned. And Sherry said earlier, you know, interracial adoption is complex. It is complex. And I can't stand in my dad's shoes. I can't go back to the time when he was growing up, into the era when he was growing up, when it was okay to call somebody a darkie, when it was okay to have a stereotypical view of people who came from the Caribbean or came from Africa or came from India. I make no bones about it. In my book, I've said that my dad was a racist. It's not an easy thing to say. It's not an easy thing for my family to hear. But I had to make some hard decisions to actually put that in there. But it does have context behind it, because to some point, I can't blame him, because that's what he knew. That's how he was brought up. And I think there's probably people in the audience who can relate to that, whose grandparents and whose great-grandparents maybe have those attitudes or had those attitudes. And my belief is nobody's born racist, no more than they're born sexist or homophobic. That's learned behavior, that's taught behavior. So part of my journey has been going back to the source of that. Where did that come from? Who created those ideologies and for what purpose? So what I've put in that book is at the end of a long period of studying. Books, people, travel. So it wasn't easy, and I didn't do it lightly. And I just want people to understand that, the context in which things are written.
Thank you, Rich. And there's one final question before we conclude this evening.
Hey, Uncle Rich.
Hi, Emily.
I know you love your biological family and your adopted family. Say when you was 9 months old and you was put into adoption, and you was adopted by a black family, do you think you would have craved to know your biological family as much as when you did when you was with our family? Did you crave the culture, or did you crave knowing them?
I think it's a really good question, actually, and one that I hadn't thought about before, so it's off the top of the head. Probably not. I think it's hard for difference to be ignored. And I take nothing away from my family and from my parents in terms of doing the best they could for me. But because of the difference and because of bias, both at home and in the environments I lived, that's the differentiating factor. The onslaught of racism away from the house, away from my family, meted by schools, by individuals, that's what set me on the path of discovery. But there is nothing in my 52 years that I would change. Yeah, it's been traumatic and painful. But if it hadn't happened, well, I wouldn't have all you people in front of me today. I wouldn't have my beautiful daughters, my wife in front of me today. And I wouldn't be on this continuous journey to help anybody who needs to be helped, anybody who's gone through what I've gone through. And then, you know what? It doesn't even have to be about racism. It's also about how it feels to be on the end of any form of discrimination or bias or exclusion. At the end of the day, we're all human beings and we all have feelings and we all feel, it all feels the same, but just wrapped up in a different kind of package. So I hope that goes somewhere to answer your question.
Just put the microphone in front of your mouth.
To me and my family, you're my brother, I love you as much as I love Paul, and we don't see anything else. We love you because you're our family. And that's all I want to say. I'm sorry if I don't understand all of it, but that's how I feel.
And I appreciate that. So, for those of you who don't know, that's my middle sister, Joanne. I know that and I understand that. And, you know, end of the day, you know, racism is not your fault, you know? And I don't expect you to understand it all, no more than I can understand what it's like to give birth to a child. Okay, right, but you say it hurts, and I say it hurts, but unless you unpick what that hurt means, you're not going to understand. So all you do is you accept, and you empathize as much as you can do. And that goes for everybody, anybody who knows me. If I tell you that story, if I tell you the stories in that book, I'm not telling you to take a walk in my shoes or to understand as I understand. Just know it's somebody's experience. And if that's enough to stir emotions in you, then when you see it happen to somebody else, I hope that you upstand and not bystand. When it's time to say something to somebody who's committed that crime or that act, say something. Because you've heard. That's all I ask.
Wow. I'm sure those conversations will be ongoing. Richard, we virtually come towards the end now. On behalf of Richard, we would like to thank 8 Sense Media for filming. We'd like to thank Ecom Media for the book. We'd like to thank the museum, Bristol Museum and Art Gallery, for sponsoring this whole event today. And Rich, obviously we thank your family and we thank everyone for being here, but we would like to thank you for opening up your soul. There is so much more in the book that you haven't spoken about, but for you, you've done something today. You made history all those years ago, and you've made history again today. And for that, we thank you.